Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. Today, I'm delighted to talk again to Dr. Abdullah Sweedy. You are most welcome, sir.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Abdullah Sweedy is a Swedish convert to Islam who holds a PhD in Islamic theology and is a specialist in topics related to atheism. He has been teaching at the Al-Masjid an-Nabawi and the Islamic University in Medina, and has been active in teaching Islam in Sweden for over 15 years. And he's sitting, as I said before we went on live, he's sitting in front of his library. But he told me he has another library. He has two libraries. He has an Arabic library. He's sitting in there, which I've seen. It is vast. And then another library. I've only got one library, and it's only in English. So he's a university academic. I'm just a lay person, so that's my excuse anyway. But Dr. Abdullah has kindly agreed to give us a talk about violence in the name of secular ideologies. This is a really important subject. So the title of this talk, as I say, is Violence in the Name of Secular Ideologies. But isn't it the case that violence is usually perpetrated in the name of religion?
Yeah, thank you very much, Paul. Nice to be here one more time. And like you said, usually when we hear violence, it's usually mentioned in the name of religion, and especially Islam when it comes to the media. And I think that this is also one of the most common arguments that atheists use against religious people, and especially against Muslims. We can see the whole new atheist movement that started after 9/11. The first book that was written was by Sam Harris, and he started to think about the book that he wrote straight after 9/11. And the book End of Faith came out 2004, and the subtitle of the book is Religion, Terror, and Future of Reason. So he focused on the topic of violence in the name of religion. Mm-hmm. And the second book of the four horsemen, as they used to be called, of the atheist movement, God Delusion, we saw Richard Dawkins. He also focused a lot on the topic of violence in the name of religion, and he was speaking about violence in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and different kind of violent acts that religious people made. The third book was one of the four horsemen too. God is not great. Why religion poisons everything, by Christopher Hitchens. And like we can see from the title, he focused a lot of his efforts in the book about issues related to violence in the name of religion and so on. And the new atheist movement started to die out, what I see these days. Christopher Hitchens died. Yeah, Christopher Hitchens died. Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, they're in the 80s. They're old now. So they're not as active.
Sorry to interrupt. Just Richard Dawkins. I saw a tweet the other day. Someone showed this to me at Speaker's Corner yesterday. A tweet where Richard Dawkins saw no moral objection to eating human flesh on a tweet. Wow. I kid you not. Almost justifying cannibalism because he could see no moral reason to object to it. So he's reached that level of discourse. Anyway, I just thought I'd just throw that little tidbit in.
Yeah, it's sick. But we can see that even if the movement, as it used to be like 10 years ago, is not that strong, their books sold millions of copies, and their debates, millions of views on YouTube, and the arguments that they use, especially when they focus on the issue of violence in the name of religion, is still one of the most common arguments that atheists use today. And I think that the argument is has some effect on religious believers, and especially on Muslims, and they always have to try to defend themselves when it comes to this issue. And you see some of them, they might become weak in their faith when they hear about this argument. And some of them, they're trying to come with a counter argument, say, no, Islam is only peace. It's prohibited with all kinds of violence in the name of religion and so on. And that's not really true. So I think this issue is very, very important to tackle and to speak about, and also to see the whole issue in in a more comprehensive view, so we can see how violence was perpetrated in the name of different religions and also in the name of secular ideologies. So I think that those who usually raise this objection against Islam especially are either Christians or seculars. And I think that you had a talk here on your channel about violence in the Bible before. Yeah. So I think it's quite important to speak about violence in the name of secular ideologies, because it's not a topic that is usually addressed, what I see. And I think it's important that we speak about this subject too. And I think it's also important that when we speak about violence in the name of secular ideologies, that we mention secular ideologies and not in the name of atheism. Because I think it's pretty seldom that anyone commits an act, a good act or a bad act, in the name of atheism, because atheism is the absence of belief. Usually atheism is a part of a political ideology or some philosophy or something like that. And it's the basis of some actions, but it's very seldom that people say that they do anything. I give charity in the name of atheism, or I kill someone in the name of atheism. I think that's pretty seldom. But atheism itself is the foundation of many secular ideologies, either outspoken atheism or practical atheism, like people, they are living their lives as God does not exist and so on. So I think that to be more specific, when we speak about the subject, we speak about violence in the name of secular ideologies, and atheism, practical atheism or theoretical atheism is the foundation or the basis down there, but usually they do not do the crimes or the violence in the name of atheism. And that's one of the reasons or the objections that Richard Dawkins raised in his book, God Delusion. He said that Stalin did not kill anyone in the name of atheism and so on. And he practiced state atheism in his state, in Soviet. Okay, and atheism is a foundation of communism, but the atrocities was usually perpetrated in the name of communism and not in the name of atheism itself. If we look at the numbers of how many people that were killed in the name of different religions and ideologies and so on, there's a book, a study called Body Count, a quantitative review of political violence across world civilization. Oh, you got the book over there.
And you got it here, and you can get this. This is the actual book. It's called War and Peace in Islam, the Uses and Abuses of Jihad, and it's edited by some very distinguished academics. It's available. You can get it online, a PDF for free, actually. But the hard copy is actually very inexpensive. And there is a chapter there, as you say, dedicated to this academic survey of mass killings in history, which you're now going to tell us about.
Yeah, and the researcher, he studied conflicts from 2,000 years back to our age. I think it's like hundreds of conflicts, and the religious beliefs behind the violence that was perpetrated and so on. And he mentioned a minimum toll and a maximum toll and a median toll for every, because it's very hard to know, like different wars that were conducted like 1,000 years ago, how many people died. So maybe someone would say 1 million, someone would say 2 million. So
I've noticed that, you saw that in the Iraq war when America obviously invaded and attacked Iraq. I mean, the number of civilian deaths does vary depending on how you define it. I've noticed they're more conservative and more greater numbers estimated. So there's not an exact number. I guess it depends how you calculate it.
And this was a war that was conducted in this age.
Just a couple of years ago, let alone in the Middle Ages. How do you... So presumably the further back in history you go, the more unreliable the statistics are. But he discusses the methodology of it in the survey, by the way. So people can read about it in the book.
Yeah, and he mentioned the different wars. And when we go to the median toll, he said that Christians, number of people that were killed by Christians, 177 millions. And the second was anti-theists, so seculars, 125 million people dead.
Yes.
Then Cynic religions in China, 107 million. And then Buddhists, 87 million. And primal indigenous, different religions like old religions, 45 million. And then the Islamic faith, 31 million. And Indic faith, 2 million. So we see that anti-theists, seculars, they actually the number of people died by anti-theists and seculars were almost four times more than the number of people that were killed by Muslims. And we can see that Christianity and Buddhism and Cynic religions have existed since the beginning of the counting in this book, 2,000 years. And anti-theism only existed for about 200 years. And the atrocities in the name of anti-theism were only like in the 20th century, maybe a bit in the 19th century. So it's pretty strange that we can see that those who use the argument most against Muslims, either Christians or anti-theists, they are actually the ones that killed more people in history, most people in history, and much, much more than Muslims. So I think it's pretty interesting. At the same time, it's very horrible to see how many people are killed in all of these wars, and especially in the names of Christianity and in the name of anti-theism.
If I could just quote about the Muslim findings here, it says, however, in terms of the death toll, the Muslim world's share of death toll is ranked at the bottom. So you have Christians, you have anti-theists, you have the Cynic civilizations, is Japan, you have India, and so on and so on. The Islamic survey comes at the bottom, which is interesting. The Islamic death toll of 31 million amounts to 5% of the total world death toll. This is in war, and is thus around a sixth of the Christian world's share, just a sixth, and around a quarter of the anti-theist contribution. This is the secularist category. In the genocide category, however, the death toll is somewhat lower at 2%. So the statistics for Islam are really low. The Christian one, shockingly, he says, in comparative terms, we have found the open secret of world history to be that Christian societies in history have been the most bellicose on all counts. Bellicose means inclining to start wars, warlike. They are responsible for the highest numbers of death in world history, a median of 178 million. That's over 30% of global fatalities for the period 0 up to when this survey was done in 2008. Finally, in terms of genocides too, the Christian world has perpetuated more than half of all genocides in recorded history since the year 0 anyway, at 51%. So what is called the Christian world, therefore, emerges as the most violent and genocidal in world history. That's creepy. But for our purposes, looking at the anti-theist or secular category, that comes second after this. And the Islamic category comes right at the bottom. So I do recommend you Google that. You can read it for free online, and you can read about the detailed analysis, the methodology, how the authors collated the data. There's detailed results, the key findings and analysis. It's all there. So I was giving you a few snippets of the summary findings of the book. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. You had any more questions after?
Yeah. So can it, are we saying, so can it ever be justified to use violence? Now we've seen the horrific wars in history and who's mostly responsible for it. Can it ever be justified to use violence, do you think?
Like when we hear about this immense amount of people that were killed in wars and genocides and so on, I think that we as human beings, if we have a bit of compassion and so on, can feel that we should be 100% pacifist. Like we could never, ever use violence at any stake and so on. And I think that abstaining from violence is a must for a more ordinary citizen living in a state. And we can see also, except for self-defense, if someone is trying to rob you or something like that. But if you're a citizen in a state, you should abstain from violence as much as you can. And we can see that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in his biography, when he was living in Mecca, it was forbidden for him to use any kind of form of violence when he was living there, because he was a citizen living inside of a state. But then when the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, moved to Medina, he became the head of a state and was living in a very dangerous environment. And we can see there is a big difference between a citizen and the head of the state or the state itself, because the state has to use violence in some cases. And I think it's impossible for any state through history to abstain from violence. You have to have a police force, you have to have a military, you have to defend your borders, you have to use violence in some occasions to protect your own citizens and so on. So I think it's impossible for anyone to abstain from violence totally. And when we saw the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he lived in Medina, the Arabic Peninsula was a very, very dangerous place. You could hardly move from one town to another or village to another without people looting you, attacking you, or so on. It was a violent environment that he was living in. So abstaining from violence totally when it comes to the head of a state, I think that's impossible. And if we see, like in Christianity, the famous statement that is attributed to Jesus, that he said that you have heard that it's been said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go on 1 mile, go with him 2 miles, give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. I think it's a quite beautiful saying if you are a citizen, or if you are trying to make some kind of peaceful movement or something like that. But it would be impossible to live in a state where you would practice this saying. So, like, how can you in the UK live without a police force, without a military, if a foreign state will attack your country and you will say, slap me on the other cheek, and if you take this city, take the other city, and so on. It's totally impossible to implement these sayings and these statements that are attributed to Jesus in practical life.
This is true. In practice, the Christian church later on developed the just war theory, particularly associated with St. Augustine in the 5th century, very famous early Catholic theologian and bishop, and later on by Thomas Aquinas. And it's still the case now that most of the churches, the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, and so on, accept just war. So you can go to war, you can kill in certain circumstances. So in practice, the churches ignore what the Gospels say. There's some rare exceptions. There are some pacifists, because Jesus' teaching is pacifist as presented in the Gospel. I personally don't think the historical Jesus was like that, but that's not the point. But the churches have ignored that. And it's interesting, in the end of the New Testament, when Jesus returns, he's no more a pacifist. He's no more Mr. Nice Guy. He slaughters his enemies on an industrial scale. There's masses of bloodshed that he kills vast numbers of mankind. So there's only this kind of slither of history where he is apparently pacifist, but later on he certainly isn't at the end of time in the book of Revelation anyway.
And also, if a Christian would try to go back to the Old Testament when it comes, I will speak about that later. Yeah. But the verses in the Old Testament when it comes to the rulings of war are totally different.
Yeah.
So like you said, we have two Latin terms here they used to talk about, jus ad bellum or jus in bello. So the right to start a war and how to conduct a war. If we see in Islam, there are very, very strict rules when it comes to starting a war and also how a war is conducted. That is prohibited to kill women and to kill children. And there are many statements and sayings that you cannot attack people that are abstaining from fighting and civilians and
monks and religious people who are non-combatants. Absolutely, these are all prohibited.
So it's really just fighting those who fight, fighting armies, and not killing civilians. And I think that this is a pragmatic way to look at reality, because now you have rules. How war is something that is inevitable. It has, and you have to use violence in some cases as a state. And you can either you can say no, you should just turn the other cheek. And when you really rule a state, you use different rules, and you're not really practicing your religion. Or you can do as Islam comes with, and you have, okay, this is a reality that we'll live with, and these are the rules, and obey these rules, and this is how war should be conducted. And this is what we see here in Islam. That's what we can see, that Muslim scholars are those who usually condemn acts of terror and the killings of innocent that these terrorist groups are doing in the name of Islam. They are those who condemn them at most, because from an Islamic point of view, and not just to be trying to be nice in front of the camera or something like that, they're saying like this is totally un-Islamic, because we can see in the Quran and we can see in the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that this is not allowed. This goes against our rules. So I think that
unfortunately it isn't the case. And I just point this just for the record. In the Bible, you mentioned the Old Testament. In some places, genocide, the targeted killing of men, women, and children and babies is explicitly commanded. For example, in the first book of Samuel, chapter 15, if you look at the first verses there,
Go now, attack Amalek and put to ban everything he has. Do not spare him. Kill men and women, children and infants, oxen and sheep, camels and donkeys. So it's men, women, and even infants, camels, and sheep and donkeys. So it's not just genocide on human beings; it's even genocide on animals.
And it's important to realize this is not just an historical record from thousands of years ago. The Amalekites became a symbol of evil for Christian groups and certain Jewish groups as well throughout history, even in the 20th century. And if you identify the enemy as the Amalekites, the Amalek, that meant that you could exterminate them. And the Christian groups in what is now North America identified the indigenous peoples there often as the Amalekites. They were called that. And they were thus able to be exterminated in the name of Jesus, in the name of Christian religion. And this trope has recurred over the centuries. So this is not just a curiosity of an ancient Old Testament text. This is a text that has been used and abused and repeatedly through history. And there is plenty of academic work on this terrible, terrible subject. In Islam, it's different. There are explicit rulings, as you say, in Sahih Hadith, in authentic Hadith, and obviously in the Quran. You don't attack, kill children, women, monks. People are not involved in it. You don't even cut down trees, or kill animals wantonly, or only if there's necessity because you need to eat or something, you can do that. So it's quite different, and that may account somewhat to the extraordinary statistics in here about Christian genocide and violence over the centuries being by far the most violent religion in history. There seems to be a matter of historical record, I think.
Yeah, it's even forbidden to kill ants in Islam. So yeah, so you can even kill ants. So it's not like here they're speaking about sheep and oxen and camels and so on. So you can kill animals just for the sake of killing them.
Yes,
you can also kill animals for the sake of eating them. So I think that the problem here for Christians is that the Bible becomes like a smorgasbord, like you say, and they can cherry pick from it. So you have pacifist Christians, and they say, no, we should go for Matthew, turn the other cheek, and so on. And you have other Christians say, no, we can go back to the verses of the Old Testament, and so on, which teaches genocide. So I think there's a great difference there. But when it comes to the topic that I want to speak about secular ideologies and atheists, when it comes to this issue, when you can start a war and how you can conduct a war, what are the moral standards for an atheist in this issue? I think we might find the answer in, it's a famous passage in the book of Fyodor Dostoevsky, The Brothers Karamazov, where he says, "But what will become of man then? I asked him without God and immortal life. All things are permitted then. They can do what they like."
Exactly.
So without the belief in God, there can be no objective moral standards, and it's up to every human being to choose his own moral standards. And human beings have different inclinations and in this issue. There's an American atheist philosopher, Alex Rosenberg. He said in the beginning of his book, The Atheist's Guide to Morality, said, "What is the difference between right and wrong, good and bad?" He answered, there is no moral difference between them. Why should I be moral? Because it makes you feel better than being immoral. Is abortion, euthanasia, suicide, paying taxes, foreign aid, or anything else you don't like forbidden, permissible, or sometimes obligatory? Says anything goes. And I think this, what he's saying here, anything goes, this is the big problem here with atheism. He mentions abortion, suicide, paying taxes, and so on, he said, or anything else. He does not mention violence here. I think he himself and many other atheists living today in the Western world, they are against violence against innocent people and so on. But other atheists will not agree, as history has shown us. So it goes back to different moral philosophies and secular political ideologies. And it comes back to that the moral standards will be relative and up to each and every one of the human beings and their different groups and so on to choose their own way when it comes to moral standards, when to conduct war, how to conduct war, and there are no objective standards of morality when it comes to atheism.
So I was going to ask you what the foundations for violence in the name of secular ideologies are, but you're saying there are no metaphysical foundations. There's no transcendent norms by which we must guide. That there is a fitra which kind of comes out in a lot of atheist dislike of unjust behavior, towards the innocent. But there's no moral foundation for that. It's simply how they feel. It's an emotion. How they feel comfortable. But there's no standard by which they judge things, because the standards don't exist, I would assume.
Yeah, and like you say, some atheists will feel that, and some atheists no. And I think there's a big problem here because human beings have an inclination of seeking power, seeking wealth, even on the cost of others. I don't know if you read the book, The 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene.
No.
Yeah, it's a very interesting book, but it's a very Machiavellian book, how to reach power.
I've read Machiavellian's book, The Prince, if that's what you mean. I've read that just a year ago. Again, that's very interesting.
This is a Machiavelli on steroids. So it's
Machiavelli was pretty much on steroids as it is. Whatever works is okay for the state.
That's the thing. And he came with many examples from human history, how human beings are using every single trick to reach power. So there's something inside of human beings that they want to reach power, they want to reach wealth, they want to influence others with their ideologies and so on. And if you don't have any moral standards, and if you don't believe that there's an omniscient God that knows everything you do, even if there is no law in the country, or you are above the law in the country, you are the leader, you are standing, you are coming with the laws to the country and so on, and you don't think that you're going to be responsible for your actions in the hereafter. I think this is one of the reasons why we saw all of these disasters in the name of secular ideologies. And I think the other thing that's really important too is Darwinism. Because even though Darwinism is scientific, the theory of evolution is a scientific theory in natural sciences, it has a huge impact on how human beings see themselves and how they see others. Because religions or the theist religions, they see human beings as the specific creation of God, that you're created in the image of God, or that you are a specific creation of God. And that will influence how you look at yourself and how you look at others. But if you see yourself as an animal and you see others as an animal, I think this will have an effect, because we can see that violence in the animal kingdom, that the strong enforces power on the weak, is something natural. And it can even be a good cause of evolution. It can be good for evolution that the strong eats the weaker, or the survival of the fittest, or the stronger, and so on. And we can't really speak about morality when it comes to animals. So if a lion eats a gazelle, we don't say it's immoral for it to eat. It's just doing what is natural for it. So if you try to apply this thinking on human beings, and you see that I'm an animal and others are animals, and you start to divide human beings in different races, like the first evolutionists used to do, and you say that there are stronger races and there are weaker races, and the stronger races have the right to eliminate or to attack the weaker races and so on. I think this is one of the reasons that we saw many of the disasters in the name of secular ideologies.
In Charles Darwin, I've got one of his books here, Descent of Man, actually says exactly what you just said about the stronger races colonizing or exterminating the other races. He's quite explicit about that, and doesn't seem to express that with any particular regret either. He sees it as a natural process.
Yeah, he says in the page 178, at some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world.
Yeah.
And he wrote a letter to William Graham in 1881, and he said, I could show fight or natural selection having done and doing more for the progress of civilization than you seem inclined to admit. Remember what risk the nations of Europe ran not so many centuries ago of being overwhelmed by the Turks, and how ridiculous such an idea now is. The more civilized so-called Caucasian races have beaten the Turkish hollow in the struggle for existence. Looking to the world at not very distant date, what an endless number of lower races have been eliminated by the higher civilized races throughout the world.
Wow.
Yeah.
The Darwin has yet to, perhaps it's impossible in the West for him to be deplatformed and dethroned and demonized in the way that others have, because he is the figure of modernity. And if you were to, what you say is shocking. It could have been in if you didn't say where those words were from, they could have been in Mein Kampf, for example. I mean, it's the sort of thing that Adolf Hitler would have said, because maybe it was much more common at that time to have those views.
But the evolution theory had a lot of impact on social sciences too. You had social Darwinism, and one of those who really propagated for the social Darwinism was Francis Galton. He was a half cousin of Charles Darwin himself, and this was it had a great effect on how they looked at people that they colonized. Even Nazism, like the thoughts of Hitler, was really based on social Darwinism. He was a social Darwinist. When it came back, he divided human beings in different races and saw that different races are better than other races and so on. And even Karl Marx was very affected of Charles Darwin. He even wrote letters to Charles Darwin, had contact with him. And one of his friends mentioned that after he read the book of Darwin, he could not stop speaking about him for months. So he was very affected on Darwinism.
I know that Karl Marx wanted to wrote to Darwin saying, "Can I dedicate my magnum opus, the Das Kapital on capital, to you?" And I think Darwin declined, and so the book is not dedicated to Charles Darwin, but Karl Marx wanted it to be dedicated to Charles Darwin.
He saw it as a basis for the struggle of classes. So he saw it as a basis for the historical materialism that he was propagating for. So it was very, very important for his theory. And also when it comes to radical forms of capitalism in the 19th century and also in the 20th century, how they look at poor people. They are weaker people, and it's the right of the richer people to abuse them or to take their wealth.
A terrible example happened to Ireland because of English economic fanaticism, free market fanaticism, and it led to the potato famine in Ireland, the deaths of millions of people, completely avoidable deaths. And actually the way the Ottomans came in, the Muslims, to offer support and aid to the white Irish, and this is something that's forgotten about, well, not almost completely forgotten, is that the Muslims came to assist and help the Irish because of British genocidal economics in the 19th century.
So I think that these are from the most important foundations of when it comes to violence in the name of secular ideologies. That you don't have any objective moral standards, and also what Darwinism did when it comes to different ideologies. Most of the ideologies were really effective when it comes to the ideas of reducing human beings to animals, and also when it comes to the struggle of the fittest and so on.
Gosh. So when did violence start in the name of secularism, do you think?
I think the first time when seculars came to power was with the French Revolution. And the French Revolution was very anti-clerical. There's a British professor called Michael Burleigh, and he wrote a book called Earthly Powers, Religion and Politics in Europe from the French Revolution to the Great War. And he says in the page 97 about the revolution, he mentioned there was 250,000 people that died during the revolution, after the revolution. He said that this was the first occasion in history when an anti-clerical and self-styled non-religious state embarked on a program of mass murder that anticipated many 20th century horrors. The secular state was just as capable of unimaginable barbarity as any inspired by religion. So,
because there are still in France today, I've seen it, prominent historians and French intellectuals in France today that still defend that. When this is brought up, they say, yes, it was terrible. The reign of terror, as it was called, was terrible, but it was necessary. It was necessary. You needed it to protect the revolution. And they can do it. They have the public space in secular France to say this, and they're allowed to say it. Remarkable.
Yeah, and I think I will come to that in the end of the talk. I think this is a big problem in the Western world, that many of the atrocities and many the killings and things that happened during colonization and so on, you still have people propagating for it and defending it openly. So I think, and it's
controversial. I don't want to get the impression that France loves it and it supports him. There is a big argument about it in France, don't get me wrong, but nevertheless people do defend it publicly, prominent people.
And we saw, like you said, in the region of terror, it was highly anti-religious, and they even transformed churches. Even Notre Dame, they transformed it to what they call temples of reason, and they had a festival of reasons and so on. So I think this was the first time where violence was perpetrated in the name of secular ideologies, and it's pretty interesting because it was the first time they reached power and straight away they started to use terror. So it was not like something that evolved during centuries and so on that we can see maybe in other religions and so on. It was like the first time they came to power, they started to use terror and violence straight away. Yeah.
Okay, so which are the most violent secular ideologies, if you can rank them like that? Which are the most violent ones?
Of course, there are many different secular ideologies. Some of them are violent and others are not. And some of them are more violent than others. These secular ideologies have a lot of hatred between one another. You have like capitalists against communists and so on. And I think it's a pretty remarkable quote that I found from the atheist professor Yuval Harari. He wrote a very famous book called Sapiens, Brief History of Mankind. Was translated to about 40 languages and so on. But he wrote another book called Homo Deus, A Brief History of Tomorrow or something. He wrote in the book, he actually calls secular ideologies for the religion of humanism. And he's an atheist and he's a Darwinist and so on. But he calls it the religion of humanism and calls the different secular ideologies for religious sects. So he says, initially, the difference between liberal humanism, socialist humanism, and evolutionary humanism is like more social Darwinism and so on, seemed rather frivolous. Set against the enormous gap separating all humanist sects from Christianity, Islam, or Hinduism, the arguments between different versions of humanism were trifling. As long as we all agree that God is dead and that only the human experience gives meaning to the universe, does it really matter whatever you think that all human experiences are equal or that some are superior to others? Yet, as humanism conquered the world, these internal schisms widened and eventually flared up until the deadliest war of religion in history. And like I said, this is an atheist saying this. And then he said after that, from 1914 to 1989, a murderous war of religion raged between the three humanist sects, and liberalism at first sustained one defeat after the other. Not only did communist and fascist regimes take over numerous countries, but the core liberal ideas were exposed as naive at best, if not downright dangerous. Just give freedom to individuals and the world will enjoy peace and prosperity. Yeah, right. So when he is speaking about secular ideologies, he's speaking about them as religious sects because people are defending them as people of, and they are fighting for them and they are ready to die for them and they believe in them and so on, just as people belonging to different religious sects believe in their religious sects. So I think that the most violent of these sects was probably communism, according to the Black Book of Communism. Many authors wrote that book. They mentioned that over 90 million people were perished because of the violence and the politics of communists. Lenin, Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, successive leaders of North Korea, Mengistu in Ethiopia, and so on. And the strange thing when it comes to communism, that most of the killings occurred only about in 50 years, from 1920 to 1970 or something.
Interesting.
And it's tens of millions of people that perished during 50 years of time. So yeah, it's incredible. And the second ideology was Nazism and also other form of nationalistic fascisms. The Nazis only ruled for 12 years. And it was especially during 6 years that they did most of the killings. From 1933 to 1938, it was not so much killing. It was between 1939 to 1945. And they killed tens of millions of people because of their ideology. because of their social Darwinistic ideology, that they were dividing people in different races. And even like when they occupied Poland, they saw Poles as some form of subhumans. So they did not allow them to go to universities because they were lower race than the Aryans and so on. And Jews, they exterminated them, and the Gypsies, they had So this is social Darwinism at its core, really, when it comes to there's
another example of liberal genocide. It's not often mentioned. It's never mentioned, I should say, in mainstream media, but I believe it is a very real and ongoing example of liberal ideological inspired genocide in the West particularly, and that is the systematic killing of unborn children through abortion. Now, I'm not talking about, someone who's pregnant just after a couple of days. I'm talking about even up to birth, in what's called partial birth abortion in the United States, which is legal, where you can literally birth babies come almost to full term, or has come to full term, and can be dismembered. And it's I'm lost for words. It is obviously evil, and it's murder Islamically, and all decent people will see this as murder. But it is legal, and it happens on a massive scale, and it's defended tooth and nail by the Democrat Party of the United States, which is headed by John Biden, who is the president of the United States. During the campaign, he is a Roman Catholic, of course, good terms with Pope Francis. And during the election campaign, he was vociferous in defending a woman's right to kill her child in virtually all circumstances. He saw this as a virtuous act. So I mention this because, well, he's the president and it's the world superpower. But it's actually, you find it in Britain and you find it in France, in fact, everywhere in the West, where killing your unborn child is acceptable. It's seen as a right. And literally millions of unborn babies have been killed in the West in the name of freedom, feminism, freedom to choose. This is a kind of a Holocaust. The word's been used. I know it's associated with other things, but I think one can use it here because it's the systematic killing of innocent human life on an industrial scale, and it's ongoing. And of course, it's seen as murder in Islam, except at the very earliest stages. But it's seen as this murder, as it is in Catholicism and so on. But I would say this is a secular ideology that is promoting and justifying this kind of killing on a mass scale. So this is ongoing. It's happening as we speak.
Yeah, and that's for unborn babies. But even when it comes to grown people, Western states during age of colonization and till now have been responsible for millions of people that died. You have the former Minister of Foreign Affairs in India, Chachi Tharoor. He wrote a book, and he is a public and intellectual and writing books and so on. He mentioned that the number of that Great Britain was responsible for the death of 35 million Indians during British rules. 35 million. That was due because of starvation, like you mentioned in Ireland and so on, and also through killings and so on. And millions of Algerians were killed during the rule of France.
I was going to mention Algeria. It was horrific.
And that was after World War II. It began in the 19th century, but it continued to after World War II with over 1 million Algerians being slaughtered and killed in ways similar to the ways of the Nazis.
But the French Republic at that time was explicitly secular. That was laïcité. This is the word they used. And the French Republic has never formally apologized for this act of genocide committed in the name of secularism. It's never admitted guilt, which is interesting.
You can even see now in the presidential elections now between the different, you have some of the candidates actually defending the colonial area over there in
Emil Zemmour, famously, of course, notoriously, he was one of the candidates, has expressed his, pride and so on for that period in history.
And the father of the other candidate, Le Pen, was actually participating in the war over there. Yeah.
Jean. The Le Pen senior was very much involved in that. Yeah. And
during World War II, it's usually associated with the atrocities of Nazis and communists and so on. But even Western powers during World War II committed a lot of mass killings. You can see that the bombing of Tokyo, during one day, they killed between 100 and 200,000 people, and most of them were civilians. And Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and this was like real mass killings of civilian people living. It was state terrorism when it comes to killing people. And during the Cold War, also war in Korea and Vietnam and Cambodia, and millions of people died during those wars and so on. And even in our age, there's an institute called Watson Institute in Brown University, has a page called Costs of War, about the war on terror. And they mentioned that 929,000 people died because of the war on terror, and 38 million people were displaced. So I think when it comes to Western powers, I think that are treating their own citizen much, much better than Nazis and communists. But the difference is how you treat the others, how you treat people in other countries, and how you treat people that are not white Westerners during the age of colonialism and so on. And I think another difference is that you don't really find that they admit of the crimes that they did in the same way that you can find with Germans admitting the atrocities of Nazism, and even Soviet after Stalin. You see the Khrushchev, he admitted many of the atrocities that Stalin made. And you can see until today in Belgium, if you go to Belgium, you can find an avenue in the name of Leopold II, you can find a statue of him, you can parks and so on, in the name of a person that was responsible for the killing of about 10 million people in Congo. And he's still kind of a hero in the country.
This is an interesting example because people often, it's not normally known in the West. I don't know how well known in Belgium it is, but their great king was responsible. And this is not a polemical point. This is not a bit of marginal conspiracy theory. It's not directly responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of people in Africa as a part of Belgium's colonial enterprise there. So this is a matter of its historical. I'm also remember of Julian Assange. I don't necessarily agree with everything he does. The Australian WikiLeaks. Exactly. Yeah. WikiLeaks. But one of his great crimes, of course, which is why America is so keen to keep him in prison, is because he exposed American war crimes in Iraq. He actually put them in the public domain. There's footage of American military slaughtering innocent Iraqi civilians in clearly a war crime. And I assume Assange wanted to bring this to public attention in much the way that we rightly expose Putin's crimes in Ukraine and so on. And we want to hold him to account and bring him to justice and the International Criminal Tribunal. Fine. But can we do it when we do crimes as well, please? Or is it just the enemy that must be held to account and we get off scot-free and we can do what we want because it's us and we're above justice. We create what justice means. Justice is the enemy gets punished when it does wrong, but we get off scot-free. I mean, that sounds really cynical, but I actually think we're forced to that conclusion. I can't think of any other conclusion. If Julian Assange is in part being incarcerated because of exposure of American war crimes, which are on public record. If you dig around, you can find what they are. How can we morally criticize Putin and wish to hold him to account for his actions, alleged actions or real actions in Ukraine? I just don't get it. I don't get where our moral consistency, our moral framework is. It's actually quite demoralizing when you try and have confidence in justice when this inconsistency is so blatant, I would think.
Because you don't have any objective moral standards. It's just going to be the stronger impose his own moral standards on others. So, yeah.
Yeah.
I think this is something that is important too. I started to speak in the beginning of the talk about the four horsemen of new atheism. And you can see that some of them were vocally supporters of the war in Afghanistan and the war of Iraq, like Christopher Hitchens. He said there's something good. Yeah. And you can see someone like Sam Harris, who was the first one that wrote a book in the New Atheist movement. He mentioned in the book, The End of Faith, that some propositions are so dangerous that it might be even ethical to kill people for believing in them. And he also said, when he speaks about an Islamist regime having nuclear weapons, he said, in such a situation, the only thing likely to ensure our survival may be a nuclear first strike, not that they strike first, a first strike from them, of our own. Needless to say, this would be an unthinkable crime, as it would kill tens of millions of innocent civilians in a single day, but it may be the only course of action available to us, given what Islamists believe. So I don't really think that they are against violence. They're against some kind of violence.
Exactly. Yeah. This is the thing. Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State under Clinton's administration in the United States, who died literally a week ago, I think, much praised for her statesman-like character and her matter of principle, standing up for freedom in the world. But she's on record, and you can watch this on YouTube, because at a time in the 1980s, 1990s, I forget exactly when, there were American-imposed sanctions on Iraq, and tens of thousands of Iraqi children died of starvation directly because of American sanctions. And she was asked about this, and she said, I can forget the exact words, maybe you can remember, it was a price worth paying. And you can imagine, if that had been said of Americans, if she had said that to Americans about American babies, she would have been kicked out of office immediately. But because it's Iraqi babies, presumably Muslims, perhaps not white either, I don't know, it was a price worth, as she actually said that, or words to that effect. And this is the American Secretary of State. So the deaths of vast numbers of innocent babies in another country, hopefully if it's an Arab country or Muslim country, a non-white, it is seen as acceptable by this great woman who was valorized and praised recently in obituaries all over the media for being a great woman and defender of freedom, etc. And she was a Democrat under Clinton. She wasn't an extreme right-wing person. She was in the Democratic administration of Clinton. I mean, this is, I mention this not because it's somehow exceptional, but because I think it's actually normal. It's when the first black Secretary of State, I forget his name now, died just a few months ago, who was played a key role in the lies that led to the attack on Iraq. He was valorized and praised. I forget his name now. In very similar. Sorry.
Colin Powell?
Colin Powell, thank you. Colin Powell was praised to the hill. I actually remember reading the obituaries in the Times and the BBC, not a whiff of criticism, even though his lies led directly to the killing of perhaps millions of innocent people in the same country, Iraq. So this kind of is normal, I think. And yet we think of ourselves as loving freedom, unlike these foreigners. We believe in the rule of law. We believe in justice, fair play, respecting the rights of people. Well, maybe we do, actually, if you're a citizen in New York, Boston, Massachusetts, ideally, places like that, but not if you're in other places, particularly abroad, especially abroad.
It's the definition of who is a human. It's a definition, who is a human when you're speaking about human rights. Are you speaking about all human beings, or are you speaking of specific human beings? Do everyone have human rights or not? So I think that also goes back to the whole thing of moral standards, and that everything becomes relative, and the strong would impose his moral standards on others.
Yeah.
That I think concludes what we have been speaking about today. The whole thing, the whole argument that they're using, that, There have been violence in the name of Islam. There have been violence in the name of religions. Yeah, but look at yourself. Look at your history. Look at what happened, and so on. And I think that really concludes everything. Yeah.
Mm. Well, I feel thoroughly depressed now. I mean, maybe I should have said what I said. I just thought it was obvious, Anyway, but thank you very much, Dr. Abdullah Sweedy, for your time, your expertise on this. And it's a wake-up call, I think, to us that secular ideologies can be lethal, whether it be in the encouraging and endorsement of mass abortion on demand, which is, I say, an ongoing genocide as we speak, or in justifying because there's no metaphysical foundation to atheist worldviews. We're not held accountable. At the end of the day, we can do what we want, and power and might is right. Whereas in traditional religion, of course, in Islam, there's a wonderful word in Arabic, taqwa, this idea of God consciousness or fear of God, depending how you translate it, which is kind of, for a committed Muslim, this really is, you're not just acting out your whims and desires. You are following God's commandments, and God says very clearly, do not kill innocent people, women, children, babies, monks, priests, whatever. Don't even cut down trees unnecessarily. So if you have taqwa, if you have fear of God or God consciousness, you're not going to do these things, but you don't have that constraint or that moral framework, that moral universe. If you're a secularist, you simply don't have it. It's not there. Which is awful. Anyway, I guess that's it.
Thank you very much. It was very nice to speak to you, even though the topic is a bit depressing, but it's a very important subject, and I think that it's something that has to be tackled, and that you can read about it more and so on. And I think that it's a very, very important and interesting topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And if you want to look at that survey that was mentioned about genocides and deaths by religion, by ideology, you can get this on PDF online for free. War and Peace in Islam, Uses and Abuses of Jihad, but it does talk about other religions as well. Very extensive research there. So I do recommend that as well. So I guess that's it for today. Thank you so much again, Abdullah. It was a pleasure to talk to you, and continue your good work in a university and doing dawah in Sweden as well. So thank you very much. Until next time.
Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.